Europe, early 1940s. The sky still carried the smoke of a fallen France. The Luftwaffe ruled above a machine of precision and pride. Every radio broadcast began with the same declaration: no one can rival German engineering. By 1941, Germany possessed over 12,000 combat aircraft, more than the combined strength of Britain and America at that moment. The United States had fewer than 3,000, and of those only 500 could be called frontline fighters. The imbalance was total. To the Germans, the war above the continent already looked decided. Then across the Atlantic, something massive began to take shape at Republic Aviation. The prototype was called XP-47B, a 7-ton behemoth with an engine that looked too big for its frame. When photographs reached Berlin, Der Adler, the Luftwaffe's own magazine, mocked it as heavy as a truck, unable to climb above 6,000 meters. The Americans have built a bomber and given it fighter's wings. They laughed, and the laughter spread. Even neutral engineers in Switzerland wrote it off as a failed concept. Yet in a hangar on Long Island, Georgian-born designer Alexander Kartveli tightened bolts around the most powerful piston engine ever fitted to a fighter, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, 18 cylinders, 45 liters of displacement, nearly 2,000 horsepower. Hidden inside the oversized fuselage sat a turbo supercharger, a 700-kilogram device able to keep that power alive at 9,000 meters, where German engines began to starve for air. At the time, Germany could build one aircraft every 3 hours. America took 8. To the world, that difference confirmed the illusion of German invincibility. And so the headlines continued: American industry lags a decade behind. A Berlin columnist sneered, "A block of steel, that heavy will fall long before it ever meets an enemy." No one imagined that this block of steel would soon dive from the clouds, spitting 8 streams of half-inch bullets, and tear through the legend of Luftwaffe supremacy. If it truly was a joke, why did its roar only a few years later silence every laugh across Germany, northern France, 1942? The wind came cold off the channel and pushed under the doors of the ready room. The young flyers of Jagdgeschwader 26 sat out another gray afternoon with cigarettes and strong coffee, a dog-eared copy of Der Adler lying open on the table. Someone passed around a clipped photograph from an Allied journal, a squat, round-nosed American fighter, the Republic P-47. A laugh rose from the back. "Too heavy to fight," a pilot said. "Too slow to climb." Heads nodded in the smoke, the kind of easy confidence that comes when you think the air is already yours. That year, the order of things felt fixed. German steel, German hands, German engines. The Daimler-Benz inline purred like a watch. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 climbed like a hawk. The new FW-190 cut the air clean and mean, and the Americans' tractors and refrigerators not fighters. Instructors said it. Manuals said it. The brass in Berlin stamped it into paper: American engines, oversized, inefficient, unable to sustain climb at combat altitude. Official, scientific, enough. The JG-26 flyers joked over the photo, some lumbering contraption pretending to be a fighter. A bomber with delusions, one of them said, and the room warmed with laughter. Across the water, the sound was different. Farmingdale, New York. Night shift. Aluminum on steel. Hammers ringing until hands went numb. Heat mixed with the sharp scent of oil and metal dust. Drills screamed, floors shook, and the plant lights threw long shadows across rows of new airframes. From the road, it looked like nothing special, just another wartime shed, but inside, something enormous was coming together. On September 20th, 1942, the first P-47 Thunderbolts rolled out for delivery to the 56th Fighter Group, Silverskins wide wings, 8 Browning 50s, lined along the edges like teeth. Weight 7 tons. Climb 15.7 meters per second. 18% slower up the ladder than the FW-190. 8 guns. 13 kilograms of lead a second. A blunt tool built to outlast. The chief engineer, Alexander Kartveli, Georgian accent, "American grit," told the Washington brass, "raw strength will save lives." The line made its way back to the shop and stuck. Crews repeated it under their breath, while they torqued bolts and wiped knuckles clean, ugly, stubborn, faithful. They couldn't know yet that the very weight they were wrestling into place would one day carry men home. Back in France, the Luftwaffe ran the charts again. Clean columns on a briefing wall. FW-190 quickest to the top. BF-109 tightest in the turn. The American newcomer not worth a line. They build for comfort, not combat, an officer told the morning class. A few polite laughs. A young pilot copied the phrase into his notebook and underlined it twice. Truth, he figured, came in neat arithmetic. But the arithmetic was changing. The war was climbing. Raids pushed past 20,000 feet into air thin enough to bite the lungs. Up there, Messerschmitt engines began to wheeze and frost. That was where Cardwelli's big-barreled idea took its first full breath. Buried in the fuselage sat a turbo supercharger near 700 kilos of plumbing and purpose keeping the double Wasp alive where other motors starved. Late that autumn, the first crated Thunderbolts left the docks for England. German reconnaissance noted their size and filed the line with a rubber stamp. Unlikely to affect balance of power. The arrogance fit neatly into the paperwork. At the JG-26 barracks, the routine held. Fog takeoffs, gun checks, cigarettes traded for stories, claims counted before they existed. The air looked the same as it always had. Clear lanes, steady engines, the quiet assurance that the Reich still sat highest on the ladder. They didn't feel the shift yet. Not in the numbers, not in the wind, but it was there tucked inside a machine they'd already laughed off. The P-47 wasn't pretty and it wasn't light. It didn't leap like a hawk or dance like a Messerschmitt. What it did was endure. It could take a pounding roll into a dive that felt like the earth was pulling on a chain and still find its way back on one wing and a prayer. No one in that ready room could see it then. The picture on the table looked like a joke. Before long, that joke would come down out of the sun and press their legend flat. April 1943. Northern France wore a cold light that morning, the kind that settles in men's bones. The mission was Ramrod 16 rail yards at Rouen. Get the fortresses there, get them home, keep your nerve in between. Dozens of B-17s lifted out of England with a sound like Sunday hymns sung through metal. Riding herd above them came the new escorts, the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group. Across the channel, the Abbeville boards lit up silver dots, steady course. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 moved fast. Helmets, zips, ladders, the clean snap of harness buckles. They slid into Fu-190A4's proud machines with sharp edges. They'd heard about the jug. The word made them grin. A barrel with wings. A truck painted like a fighter. Throttles opened and the field dropped away. At 9,000 meters, the air turned thin and bright. The Americans saw them first black specks climbing hard. Then came that note from the R-2800s, deep and certain through the turbochargers. 7 tons of airplane tipped forward and went down the ladder like a dropped hammer. The Germans tried to follow, but the high air was mean. Engines coughed, props clawed at oxygen that wasn't there. 8 guns aside. 750 rounds per gun per minute. 6,000 rounds each second. 13 kilograms of hot metal pouring through the air. The first P-47s split the formation like thunder splitting oak. 1 long burst 4 seconds, and 2 FW-190s came apart before the rest could scatter. The USAF line afterward was brief, almost shy. 2 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single pass. The German logbook didn't waste words. Burst penetrated wing armor. Pilot did not escape. The duel vanished. Horsepower and procedure took its place. Down on the fields of Normandy, farmers looked up at bright streaks and then kept their hats on as pieces fell. Rain made of iron, one said later. The next week, the Germans tried again near the coast, coming up under the sun for an ambush. The Thunderbolts met them head-on, high and quick. Rolls dives a freight train howl, and the formation broke before the first trigger squeeze mattered. By June, the math spoke louder than rumor. 56 victories. 15 losses. Survival rate 60% better than P-38 and early P-51 units. Nobody in the papers back home needed to brag. The flight lines could read the truth in empty chairs and full ones. Inside Allied outfits, the wisecracks faded. Men who'd called it a flying brick were putting in for transfers. They learned its proper rhythm: fast, down hard, out straight for home. A dive bomber's heart in a fighter's frame. It could swallow punishment that would have ripped lighter birds to rags. June 26th brought a story that ran through every mess in England. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson took 4 FW-190s head-on. Cannon tore through the fuselage cut. The controls blew the panel to glass and smoke. The canopy jammed. By any fair rule, the airplane should have folded. The engine refused. The R-2800 coughed, caught, and kept pulling. Half blind and bleeding, Johnson nursed the bird back across cold sea and onto a friendly strip. The crew counted holes, 200 of them, while the prop still turned slow and steady. Word travels fast when it smells like truth. Even German briefings carried the line avoid combat dives with the new American fighter. The joke had bent into a warning. The noise they once laughed at was now the last thing a man heard before flame and silence. In hangars and ready rooms, the Luftwaffe stopped saying P-47. They called it that monster. Coffee cooled in cups while officers reviewed charts that no longer promised an easy climb. The sound in their headphones had changed color. It rolled closer, denser, like weather you couldn't fly around. On the American side, the lesson took hold. This was no longer a dance scored for aces. It was schedules and spare parts, crews and checklists, mass and speed, learning how to throw the first punch and still make it home for chow. The pilots felt it in their hands when the stick got light in a dive, and in their ribs when the big radial came back to idle on the ramp. For the Germans, disbelief came first. Then the kind of fear a man won't name. The radio didn't carry thunder from far away anymore. It carried a nearer sound, the Pratt Whitney growl rolling over the channel and hunting daylight. The easy laughter of 42 thinned out on the aprons. The numbers on briefing walls stopped offering comfort. And somewhere above 9,000 meters, an American fighter kept proving the thing no one wanted to admit: the balance was beginning to answer to different rules. By the winter of 43, the world had changed its mind. It didn't rise clean anymore. It sagged, filled with smoke and arithmetic. The Luftwaffe, once sharp as a knife, had turned into a shield full of holes. The first cracks didn't show in the clouds. They opened in the ledgers, in the fuel lines, in the faces of young men who still thought they could hold the line. Numbers rolled in like bad weather. Fuel shipments down 60%. Ploiești burning. Luna hit again. Cadets logging 80 hours instead of 200. They learned to lift off, to climb to fire, and the rest they learned in combat. Sometimes once. Never twice. Across the water, the 56th Fighter Group kept coming. Cut them down on Tuesday, see fresh paint on Thursday. New pilots, new airplanes, new hands on throttles. Reports called it endless waves of silver. What had been a contest of nerve was turning into a contest of supply. In Berlin, Adolf Galland, the youngest general they had sharp as a whip, sat at a desk buried in figures no courage could bend. Fuel, ammunition, replacement rates. The sums wouldn't lie for anyone. One night he told his aide, quiet as confession, "We are no longer fighting the enemy. We are fighting arithmetic." The sentence moved through headquarters like a cough nobody wanted to mention. Out on the fields, the briefings shrank. The silences grew. Pilots were told to glide on descent and save the last leaders. Mechanics kept the living flying by stripping the dead wings off one engines off another, bolts from both. They still used the word ace, but it sounded older each time. Training cut by half. Fuel below emergency. Engine output throttled by lack of oil. The winter diaries read like the backs of letters never sent. Each dawn begins with engines drinking the last of our hope, one flyer scrawled. Another wrote, even when everything is empty, it presses down. Pride held its tongue, and the Luftwaffe came apart thread by thread. Across the Atlantic, the hum never stopped. Farmingdale, Evansville, Republic Aviation, night shifts, sparks, rivets, hands black with grease. Every day, more Thunderbolts rolled out serials walking past 5 digits. Every night, ships slid east with holds full of wings and confidence. America didn't measure the war by battles. It measured by output. Inside the Reich, men could still get airborne, but they couldn't replace what they lost. Tanks ran dry before noon. Engines waited on fuel that never came. Instructors strapped boys into cockpits who still looked like they belonged in school photos. One by one, they vanished into the haze. What used to be called discipline now looked a lot like exhaustion. Airfields turned into graveyards of twisted metal. Maps weren't drawn for strikes anymore. They marked what couldn't be defended. The hunter had become the hunted, and nobody needed to say it out loud. Then came the daylight raids over central Germany. Orders went out intercept. Only a handful answered. The rest sat grounded half-empty tanks and good intentions. The men in the towers gave the word anyway. That's what duty looked like when the war had already slipped its leash. By then the turn was complete. The weather over Europe wasn't just wind and cloud, it was production. Schedules replaced swagger, ledgers replaced boasts, and far above the contrails drew their white lines from coast to coalfield while the arithmetic kept score. By 1944, courage didn't set the weather overhead anymore. Production did. The war ran on timetables, rail spurs, and the steady hum of belts that never cooled down. 8,000 P-47 Thunderbolts over Europe, 15,683 built in all, more than any other American fighter, a machine once laughed at for its weight now stamped out by the thousands, strong enough to carry a campaign on its wings. The Luftwaffe still flew, but the Thunder had a new address. It didn't roll out of Germany, it came in from the sea. The sound belonged to the Jug. Every month, 200 fresh P-47s walked off American lines. Focke-Wulf, sweating under bomb damage and shortages, scraped together 70 fighters in the same stretch of days. The gap wasn't just arithmetic, it was rhythm. America built to a drumbeat. Germany built to survive another week. Farmingdale closed a batch while Evansville was already testing the next. Crates marked Thunderbolt, stacked on New York piers like cargo made of confidence ships sliding east faster than Berlin could tally the last losses. By early 44, 96,000 American aircraft produced, Germany 39,000. What had looked like an iron wall of daylight defense started to fade like chalk in the rain. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 saw it with their own eyes each morning, the sky over France knitted with white lines, contrails crossing until the horizon read like graph paper. The Jug got meaner as the months rolled. 1,134 kilograms of bombs, 12 HVAR rockets 5 inches apiece, 8 50 caliber guns. One airplane could tear open a rail yard, a squadron could erase a convoy. From June to December 1944, the tallies came in without adjectives. 6,000 tanks knocked out 9,000 locomotives and cars, 60,000 vehicles. Clean figures on clean paper. Out in the fields, it meant bent track, broken bridges, roads choked with steel. Normandy learned the shape of that sound. The P-47s worked low and wide, like reapers on a long row. A tank nosed out of a hedgerow. A call went up. Minutes later, the Jugs came down whistling. 8 guns together, 6,000 rounds each second, then the heavy punctuation of rockets. When the echoes ran off into the trees, the only thing left was the slow tick of cooling metal. Colonel Hubert Zemke put it in a single line his men never forgot. Nothing can match the speed of American rearming. To a pilot, that wasn't strategy, it was sleep. No one went up light on ammo. If a bird limped home full of holes, another waited at dawn. Buffalo and Detroit shipped prop blades, Magneto's spark plugs, and hope faster than bombs could tear them up. Across Germany, the language in the memos soured. Redeployment and countermeasure gave way to losses, deficiency, shortfall. Late in 44, a report said, the part no one wanted to put to paper, there was no longer a zone of daylight safety. Even Bavarian training fields woke to the low American growl at sunrise. The Luftwaffe wasn't staring down another air arm anymore. It was staring down a process. A machine that learned, replaced, and sharpened itself between sorties. Fuel plants bombed at night, patched by noon. Steel mats rolled out over cratered strips by dusk. Every loss reported became a change in the next checklist. Nothing fancy, just evolution at factory speed. Out around Rouen and Caen, French farmers leaned on fence posts and watched the formations drift east. Names painted on the noses read like a road atlas: Chicago, Memphis, Tulsa, as if the map of the states was crossing the morning sky one squadron at a time. The war had turned into a geography lesson written in contrails and engine smoke. For German pilots, the world narrowed. Every climb found more lines in the blue, more noise in the headset, more light flashing off wings. They still fought hard, still took the cold in the teeth, still met whatever came with their eyes open. But even courage measured against factories and freight began to feel like a resource, one that ran out the way fuel did. By autumn, Allied planners stopped asking what Germany could resist and started asking what America could supply. The next runs went on the board not by hope but by inventory. New Thunderbolts arrived with thicker skin, longer legs radios that behaved better in weather, and the quiet kind of confidence mass production gives to men who depend on it. And it wasn't only airplanes filling the lanes overhead, it was everything behind them. Women on the floor with rivet guns, men on the line pulling double shifts, convoys shouldering through night rain, a nation moving like geared teeth in one large wheel. The Luftwaffe had been built on mastery craft ace work, the single flight done perfectly. What it faced now was momentum. So when the P-47s came down again, from 9,000 meters wings stretched edge to edge across a morning, it didn't feel like a squadron falling on Germany anymore. It felt like a civilization of metal and purpose, descending through the clouds, steady, organized, and unstoppable. By the summer of '44, the engine note had become a season of its own, steady, unhurried rolling over towns and hedgerows, like a low drum you felt in your ribs. Folks learned to live with it. Pilots called it music. The people on the line called it proof that their shifts mattered. Under the layers of steel and noise, it wasn't machines that kept the war moving. It was people. The men in the cockpit, the hands back home, the women on the floor with rivet guns. They were the grease in the gears, the reason the big radials kept turning when everything else ran thin. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, the kid who brought a jug home with more than 200 holes in her skin, put it plain. The jug tried to keep you alive. No flourish, just memory. He could still smell the burnt oil, hear the cough that turned back into a pull, feel the stick answer when it shouldn't have. Maybe without saying it, he was thinking about the ones who built her people he'd never meet. At Republic Aviation, 20,000 worked under that roof, men and women trading daylight for metal dust. Heat hung in the bays, drills biting rivets, singing sparks snapping in the shadowed corners. Many were girls, just out of school farm kids, clerks, waitresses, learning wings and wire by the book and by feel. Overalls tied at the waist, scarves knotted at the crown. Finished panels marked in chalk with small initial signatures on the skin of a giant. The papers called them the women behind the Thunderbolt. They laughed at that. They weren't behind anything anymore. A test pilot swore no two Thunderbolts flew the same. Each carried fingerprints, quirks, a little bit of the room she was born in. A girl named Helen from Queens tucked a note inside a fuselage bound for Europe. Keep her steady. Bring her home. Months later, a pilot found it. During repairs in England, folded it once and slipped it into his jacket. He carried it to war's end. The crews had a name for the plane, our stubborn child. One engineer wrote in his log, "She's our heaviest baby and the most faithful. Doesn't give up." They said the weight came from their patience, every bolt checked twice, every seam cleaned, every plate rubbed until it shone. Up in the air, another quiet outfit took the load at the Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASP. Over 1,100 of them ferried brand new jugs from factory to base. Alone in the cockpit, no guns, no escort. Fog bulky engines, long miles with only a compass for company. Some didn't come back. Their names rarely made print, but every takeoff shortened the distance between a blueprint in Farmingdale and a fight over France. Even in the thick of it, something human refused to die. Geneva reports 1944, more than 7,000 Allied airmen rescued or treated under the rules of war. Red Cross parcels reaching camps. German guards pulling wounded Americans into culverts when the bombs started to fall. Men who had traded fire sharing bread through wire. Francis Gabby Gabreski, top ace in a P-47, wrote to a friend before he was taken, If I go down, I want to believe the man who fires at me is still a man. No drama. Just a line from someone who'd seen too many faces flash past a gun sight to hate them by category. Somewhere near Cannes after a July run, an American pilot put a jug into a field and lived. A farm family hauled him clear, hid him in a hayloft for 2 weeks, fed him bread, and apples watched the front inch closer. When the uniforms he knew finally came down the road, he walked back into the village with chocolate in his pocket for the kids. No speeches, just thanks. Stories like that didn't make headlines. They moved in letters over tin cups in the mess in the talk that settles at the end of a long shift. The pilots swore the jug kept them safe. The workers swore they built her too. Both were right. Somewhere between their hands, steel learned to hold something gentler. By fall, even as the fighting roared, the tone underneath shifted. Pilots talked less about tallies and more about getting home in one piece. Crew chiefs patched with care instead of speed when care would do. Strength stopped meaning only hit harder. It started meaning hold together. The Thunderbolt was made for breaking bridges and tearing up rail. Around it, something decent took root, notes tucked under panels. Food passed through fences, names read out at reunions before anyone spoke. In all that iron and racket, a small truth kept breathing. Machines can fight a war, but only people can give it meaning. By the winter of 44, the Luftwaffe pride of the Reich was running on fumes, more than 80% of its fighter arm gone. Fuel short, training hours cut to the bone. New kids sent up with 30 hours in the seat and a prayer. Out on the fields lay rows of tired Messerschmitts stripped for parts. The swagger was gone. What stayed was fatigue. The handwriting in the logbooks changed with the weather. Reports read less like orders, more like admissions. One line from a German squadron made it through the years we lost because they built a society that knows how to organize itself. Not a complaint about machines, about people. About how Americans and Britons could turn chaos into rhythm work, into habit, into power. Men under command on one side, a system built on trust on the other. Across the channel, the 56th still launched at first light, not out of fearlessness, out of cadence. Mechanics, clerks, medics, drivers, each doing a small part that kept the whole turning. It wasn't courage that kept the Thunderbolts in the air. It was the beat of a well-run shop, the belief that every link mattered and none could be spared. Years later, 1951, Colonel Hubert Zemke said it the way flyers like it: short and true victory came from faith in the man beside you. He'd finished the war behind wire and had watched the Luftwaffe fold under its own weight. He knew what courage without cooperation sounded like. It sounded like noise. Then the guns went silent. Airstrips settled into wind and birdsong. Thunderbolts slept under gray tarps, oil cooling in their bellies. Some were cut up, some sold to new flags. A few stayed on to teach youngsters the feel of a wing. The jug kept working into the 50s, even in Korea when weather turned mean and the country got rough. Too tough to retire. It outlived the empire it helped to break. Germany woke slower, maps redrawn in sobering lines. And then came a thing no one expected. The same country that had leveled them sent ships back, this time with lumber grain steel hope. $13 billion. The Marshall Plan. Roads rebuilt. Schools lit at night. Stacks smoking again. The war engine had become a rebuilding engine. For a lot of Germans, that was the first lesson in another kind of strength, the strength to raise up instead of knock down. In 1958, a reporter asked Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's sharpest ace, why they lost. He didn't sidestep. They won because they built on the organization of a free society. He said it calm. He'd seen factories change shifts overnight, seen sergeants act without waiting on a phone, seen how a democracy's mess could outwork a dictatorship's order. The quote ran small and passed quickly the way plain truth often does. For the men who flew on both sides, the awakening didn't show up in parades. It showed up in letters, in handshakes at air shows, in old enemies drinking coffee and talking about weather instead of wounds. Some Americans came back to Europe as instructors or airline captains setting down on runways they once attacked. Others married girls from towns they'd freed. A war that had drawn borders and smoke left behind the threadwork of ordinary life. At a museum years later, a photographer caught an old German pilot beside a restored P-47. The silver skin threw back the hangar lights. The white star was as it had been. He set his hand on the metal and held it there. Asked why, he said, "It taught us the final lesson. No bitterness in it, just wait." The lesson wasn't defeat. It was endurance, humility, the work of building something larger than yourself. The Jug had started as raw power engine and muscle. It ended as a study in cooperation. The men who flew it learned that force without order scatters. Their opponents learned that order without mercy breaks. Both lessons stuck. By the early 50s, the same corridors of air that once shook with bombers carried passengers and mail, New York to Paris, Paris to Berlin. The routes traced old missions. The cargo was different. Below those lines stretched a continent paved by former enemies, men who once traded fire, now trading freight. The logistics that once fed destruction had been hired on to keep the peace. The weapons faded. The method remained planning teamwork. Aces and engineers across languages and uniforms came to the same end: a machine can win a fight, but only people can build a future. So the awakening didn't arrive with bands and bunting. It arrived with understanding. The victory that mattered wasn't who ruled the sky, it was who learned to share it. By 49, the floor at Farmingdale fell still. 8 years of hammers and drill presses, of dawn run-ups and hot oil hanging in the rafters, then a pause you could hear. The last P-47, Thunderbolt, polished bright as a mirror, rolled for the doors, with 4 words painted down her flank: "Goodbye, Jug." The folks in coveralls stepped back, hands black with grease, eyes a little wet. Some clapped. Others just stood with their rags in their pockets. The engine caught once, then settled into that old low note that lives in a man's ribs. It carried across the beams, slid out over the lot, and thinned to the east over the sound. The war was over. The machine that hauled so many boys home had earned its rest. The line came down soon after. Jigs sold, presses tarped, benches swept bare. But the airplane wouldn't fade. 3,000 Thunderbolts took to peaceful skies under French, Brazilian, Mexican, Turkish markings, new flags on old wings. Pilots who'd trained to fight now flew patrol, taught students, hauled mail. The big bird proved she still had patience in her bones. A French flyer wrote in 52. That sound now echoes only over the sea. The R-2800 still kept a steady beat over a world gone still. For him, the Jug wasn't a weapon anymore. It was duty-remembered noise turned into echo. In 53, out on Long Island, 40 men of the 56th Fighter Group found their way back to one another. Kansas farms, Brooklyn shops, Midwest garages, hair-gone gray hands still strong. They posed with a borrowed Thunderbolt palms resting on the wings like they were greeting a neighbor they hadn't seen since the harvest. Someone read the names that didn't come home. The rest listened. No speeches, just the hush between breaths. 2 years later, 1955, the last active Air Force P-47 serial 4490368 made a final circuit over the field and came in smooth. The pilot climbed down, pulled off his gloves, and set a hand on the metal. No brass band, no reporters, just wind through grass and a sound that would never be heard in uniform again. By 1961, one of the old birds was crated for Washington. The Smithsonian logged her like any honest tool panels, cleaned history, tagged, tucked away in the dark. 15 years on 1976, she stood under museum lights, silver bright against a hushed hall. Folks read the plaque and moved along. They didn't know each rivet held fingerprints: the woman who set the row, the pilot who trusted it, the crew chief who kept it breathing. Time took the shine, but not the story. The old flyers started writing. Magazines ran the photographs again. Kids built kits at kitchen tables and learned the word Thunderbolt from their fathers' voices. That shape, broad, blunt, unbending, turned into shorthand for endurance. To the men who flew her, the Jug was never just a machine. She was company. They remembered the shiver on takeoff, the heavy pull of a long dive, the fog on the canopy when the cold bit hard. They remembered limping home on one good cylinder, the calm after the wheels kissed dirt. The pat on the panel before climbing down. She wasn't graceful. She was loyal. Loyalty has a way of turning into legend. Years passed. Airframes slept in hangars, and sheds paint, going soft edges dulling. And then some Saturday, someone would swing a prop for an air show. The engine would cough, stumble, and then find its voice deep familiar a little. Rough at first, then true. Conversation stopped. Veterans looked at their shoes and blinked. The sound walked down the flight line like a pulse from another century. A few of those old birds still fly. They lift off without hurry, sunlight sliding along their wings like poured metal. For a blink, they look weightless. Everyone watching knows better. There's history writing inside that shine. The world has moved ahead. Jetliners write white lines from coast to coast. Satellites drift where storms once lived. But when a Thunderbolt climbs and the R-2800 begins to growl, the ground answers just a tremor, just enough. It's the same note that used to follow convoys and bombers across a hard continent, half engine, half memory, still moving. 70 years after the guns fell silent, the Thunderbolt still rides the wind. Not loud, not often. Just enough to remind a person the world once shook to a different rhythm. What began as a weapon became a bridge metal, turned to meaning, carrying strangers across time who never knew the fear but still hear the echo. In Dayton, Ohio, under the high lights of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, folks walk slow beneath a polished P-47 called Wicked Wobbit. The paint looks wet. 8 gun barrels sit black against silver skin. Kids stare at that big radial like it could swallow a man whole. Near the tail, an old veteran stands with his cap folded in his hands. His grandson asks, "Did you fly one?" He nods once. For him, it isn't a display case. It's a mirror, one world reflected in another. The one he survived, looking back at the one that endured. By the 1980s, the retrievals began quiet work in barns and backfields, where wings lay under weeds and fuselage frames sank into dirt. Men and women hauled them out, brushed them clean, and started again. Old blueprints. Serial numbers chased like lost addresses. New ribs bent from recollection. 15 Thunderbolts fly today in the United States, 7 across Europe. When those engines catch, people turn their heads before they know why. The ground shakes. Hearts do too. In 2019, over in Berlin, the Luftwaffe Museum set to work on a P-47 that went down near Magdeburg in '44. American and German hands together, historians, mechanics, sons of men who once looked for each other in gun sights. They cleaned the corrosion-straightened bones, wrote the story back into the metal. The little plaque under the engine speaks 2 languages and 1 truth. Once enemies, now keepers of history. Some call that preservation, others say penance. Maybe it's both. The historian John C. Fredrickson wrote it plain: no machine better reflects the transformation of American industrial thought than the P-47. Built on the idea that strength could be made by many hands, that mass production might carry the grace of a craftsman's touch. Look at it now and you don't just see a fighter. You see an idea in steel, human effort multiplied by trust, turning chaos into endurance. In France, near hedgerows that once hid tanks, the locals still gather in spring. A few veterans come what's left of them with family in tow. Flowers laid, photos passed, small flags tucked into pockets. A woman who was a child during the war tells her grandson how an American pilot shared his chocolate and flew away. The boy listens as if it were a fable. In a way it is. Back across the Atlantic, engineering students trace the lines of the jug in classrooms. The turbo supercharger that was once called wasteful, now a case study in how piston met jet, where power shook hands with precision. Professors point to the drawings. The room falls still. For them, the Thunderbolt isn't a relic. It's the first page of what came after. But reflection isn't just machines returning to life. Every rebuilt wing, every anniversary flight is a small act of grace, proof that something once forged for destruction can spend its final years teaching peace. When the engine growls and the crowd holds its breath, the old sound carries a new meaning. The same note that once announced danger becomes a thread that ties past to present. At an air show in Florida, 2 pilots meet again after half a century. One flew over France. The other trained rookies deep in Texas. A yellow-nosed P-47 taxis past and lifts away. The engine finds its center. Still sounds the same, one says. Good, the other answers. Some things ought never forget how to sound alive. The jet age came, then the space age, now the digital age. Through it all, the Thunderbolt's outline endures broad wings, thick fuselage, a stance ready to lean into the wind. It has outlasted parties' flags and every doubt once thrown its way. In every museum and hangar, where a starter whines and the old radial answers, the air carries something older than flight. The jug doesn't belong to one country anymore. It belongs to us, to that stubborn part of humanity that refuses to forget not only how we fought, but what we learned. Now the sky is calm. The old birds climb slowly, turn once, and settle back on their wheels. Their shadows pass over faces that never saw the war, and for a heartbeat, time folds the past and the present, sharing the same low vibration. People look up and listen. The sound tells what words can't progress, is measured not just by what we build, but by what we keep alive. The Thunderbolt no longer fights. It endures. And in that endurance, it keeps giving the lasting lesson. Remembering is a way of flying still.